Gagan and you're listening to the Voice of Insurance podcast, produced in association with Advantage Go. Pick and choose your own best-of-breed insurtech and data providers with Advantage Go's ecosystem. Today's episode is a fast-moving, high-intensity blast from start to finish. That's mostly because of the people I'm talking to, but also due to the circumstances under which we're doing the talking. First, the people. Richard Brindle is well known to anyone in our business as one of the most dynamic underwriters in the market. And anyone following the Fidelis story will know that now the business is split into the Fidelis Partnership and the Fidelis Insurance Group, Richard has freed up time to be even more dynamic. It's perhaps understandable that Richard Coulson, the Fidelis Partnership CEO of Insurance and Deputy Group Chief Underwriting Officer, doesn't yet have the same public profile as his namesake. But on this performance, it won't take long for that to start building. Secondly, the venue was Monaco at the Monte Carlo RendezVous. The rendezvous always heightens the intensity of any interaction. People come there ready to communicate against the clock, and that cut-to-the-chase feel very much comes through in this encounter. As a result, this podcast covers everything it should: the state of global markets and where Fidelis is positioning itself to make the most of the opportunities those markets are throwing up, the Fidelis Partnership's entrance into Lloyd's, and the two Richards' views on all the major issues of the day. Listening back, this is a really enjoyable episode, packed with singular, original, and sometimes surprising insights. Enjoy the podcast. Richard and Richard, welcome to the Voice of Insurance. Well, welcome back to Richard, and welcome for the first time, the other Richard Coulson.
Thank you very much.
Forgive me for talking about this again, but now that the Fidelis Partnership and the Fidelis Insurance Group relationship has matured and your bifurcation project is now finished, is there anything more to add to that? We spoke about this time last year when it was just all finished and you'd bedded in. Now it's really bedded in. Is there anything more to add before we park this and put this away and never talk about it again?
I would say the most important question mark over the bifurcation was how clients and brokers would react. And I can honestly say to you, not a single broker or client has recoiled or cavilled or expressed reservations about this new structure. I mean, I think that's remarkable. Even some very traditional clients who probably never had an MG or an MGA on their program have not raised any concerns. Just on that point, we do slightly reject the label of MGU, and that's one of the reasons we've branded as the Fidelis Partnership. When you traditionally think of an MGU, you think of single line of business and annual capital. And we are now writing 100 lines of business, and obviously the overwhelming amount of our business goes to the Fidelis Insurance Group, which is our sibling company. But we do also have a Lloyd's syndicate, and we have some other third-party capital arrangements. Importantly, the capital with the insurance group is 10-year rolling capital, and the Lloyd's capital is Lloyd's names. So again, the Fidelis Insurance Group, we call them our flagship, and also our siblings. They're literally upstairs from us. We're on the 42nd floor of 22 Bishopsgate. They're on the 43rd floor. We talk all the time. There is no relationship like it, by the way, in the insurance world. Not only the personal ties between the two teams, but the level of information, and I think our colleagues at the insurance group would recognise this, the level of information we supply to those guys is completely unprecedented. Most MGA capital provider relationships would probably be a quarterly communication, which in itself would probably be, shall we say, somewhat suboptimal. With us, it's real time, every day, often 7 days a week communication, particularly when there's dislocation or opportunities that come along. And I think we couldn't have a better partner, because there are frequent opportunities for dislocation in the market, which we are well known for in terms of being first to get there, first to identify the opportunity, to price the opportunity. We've just in recent days done some backups in Canada after the floods in Quebec. Nobody else got there as quickly as we did. And the IG are always at our side. And we also saw that in August when, scandalously, in my view, most of the industry seemed to down tools entirely and disappear. And we carried on working as we do. And we found opportunities across the board, and the IG were always there for us. So slightly rejecting that MGU label, we're something else. We call ourselves a diversified asset manager, a risk allocator. I don't think anybody else quite occupies our place in the spectrum. You know, you have retail MGAs, wholesale MGAs, retail brokers, wholesale brokers, carriers, reinsurers, retrocessionaires. I don't know quite what we are, but we're certainly unlike anybody else, and we're very proud of that. So, yeah, I think it all starts with the brokers and clients, and we've just had no pushback at all. Because if we don't have clients and brokers, then there's no point us even being here.
We can all see the numbers. We can see the numbers still going up, and so if there was any wobble, we would have seen it. You mentioned about the Lloyd's Syndicate. What's the ambition of the Lloyd's Syndicate? What's the reason for it?
I think Lloyd's, by their own admission, have lost ground in recent decades, both in terms of price making, thought leadership, writing new policy wordings. The Lloyd's I joined in the 80s there were plenty of faults. I mean, some of the sort of social attitudes were frankly terrible. I always stood against those. It's not a laughing matter in my view. I think they were scandalous. And it was a club that for a very long time we didn't want to be part of. And indeed, we had a look at Lloyd's 6-7 years ago, and our interaction with them was dismal. Dismal. But times change. I think the management team now with John and Patrick, Rachel, Dawn, all these people are really fantastic. And we came together through the introduction of Nick Forty at Gallagher. I just want to shout out for Nick. He's fantastically entrepreneurial individual, saying, there's an opportunity here to do something very interesting with Names Capital. I think in turn, Names have been, in my view, very unfairly marginalised, even sometimes ridiculed, as being a sort of old-fashioned type of capital for whom there is no place anymore. We entirely reject that. And we all came together with huge serendipity at the end of last year. And I think the pace at which things moved took us all by surprise. I'm well known for setting timelines. There was actually one meeting where they outbid us on a timeline by a month, and you could have knocked me over with a feather. And that's what it was like. And again, it's very complementary to the insurance group. I want to stress that. The insurance group have a variable quota share of the Lloyd's Syndicate. We essentially worked with them to identify the lines of business they were most keen on. Now, let's bear in mind, this is business which is genuinely incremental to the insurance group, which they can't access by means of licensing, counterparty limits, credit rating, or all of the above. So they're getting a slice of business they simply otherwise couldn't have accessed. So we think it's very good for everybody, but it is helping Lloyd's reclaim a lot of leadership and price making and thought leadership in areas where they've lost those things in recent years and decades.
So we're going to see you coming up with new LMA wordings, I can't remember what the latest 3-letter abbreviation. They used to be LMA back in the day, and LPSO and LPO and all these other things back in the day. I arrived in Lloyd's in the 1990s, early 1990s, and I was a bit shocked as well. And even I had been to private school, and I was shocked at how sort of backwards the whole thing seemed. But I was also impressed. There was a wording for everything, then BBB. These were all products that all had Lloyd's written all over them. But yeah, and you're right, there haven't really been that many new ones since.
You're absolutely right. There's been very little in the last 20 years. And the Lloyd's I joined was a curious mixture of the very good and the very bad. There were these sort of fossilised social attitudes. But on the other hand, we did lead, I remember at the Tarquin Syndicate in Lloyd's, we were leading pretty much everything, along with people like Brockbank and Catlin and Agnew and these sort of, Dumas, these really very, very high quality Lloyd's syndicates. Then there was a lot of dross. But we had big market shares in all the major specialty lines, 40, 50, 60, 70% market share. On the cat side, after Hurricane Andrew and the Northridge earthquake, I got heavily involved in property reinsurance cat business.
Because you hadn't really done it before.
No, and Danny Burrows was the first broker I dealt with. He brought me in the Norwegian's natural perils pool in 1993 or 4, and they couldn't place it. And we quadrupled the price and took a 15% lead line, and they still couldn't place it. They got to 60%, but that was an incredible market. And we then quickly assumed a very, very large market share at the peak of the market. So even then, Lloyd's was the dominant market for property cat placements. Now, the Lloyd's order is often under 10%, and a lot of major clients don't even go to London anymore because the money's all in Bermuda and they go there. So it's a case of Lloyd's moving back out of the margins into this position of leadership. And I think John and Patrick and those guys regard us as absolutely essential to that process.
And what are you getting out of it that you wouldn't get outside?
Well, I think we've been really pleasantly surprised by the reception, especially as we look at more international diversification. The Lloyd's brand internationally is incredibly strong. And there's a real recognition for that as we expand internationally, for that being the capital that we're writing onto. So I think that's one thing. I think we've been very pleasantly surprised also by the appetite to this lead and follow point of other syndicates reaching out, recognizing our leadership position in certain niches or certain portfolios of lines of business, and looking to us to set up consortia to lead lines of business for others to follow. I think we've been really pleasantly surprised that now we're in the club. We're certainly getting a lot of incoming phone calls from a variety of syndicates talking about mutually beneficial relationships, which I think is going to be great for the benefit of ourselves and for the insurance group.
Are you ready to unlock the full potential of data, AI, and automation in your business? Attend the Data Jam on November 28th in London, where insurance leaders and experts come together to explore how data can drive digital transformation.
From transforming your customer experience, streamlining operations, and staying ahead of the competition with cutting-edge technologies, you'll find the latest insights at the Data Jam. Dive deep into the power of AI, learn the latest in data management, and discover how emerging technologies are reshaping the industry, all under one roof.
The Data Jam is not just about the tech. You'll get real-world insights and case studies in underwriting, claims, and operation. Plus, you'll discover how to leverage data to drive innovation in your organization.
Make data work for you. Search Data Jam today and join the insurance leaders transforming their business and operating models. Use the code VOICE for a 20% discount. That's Data Jam, November 28th in London. See you there.
We spoke about this last year, Richard. I think of you as being a sort of a line to stand type underwriter. You'd probably got lots of pet hates, but one of the biggest one would be you don't want your lines signed down after doing lots of work. When you're moving into a more collegiate environment like Lloyd's, that kind of subscription market, collegiate culture, was that great with that kind of line to stand sort of feel?
No, I don't think so. I think the Lloyd's obviously is a marketplace, so different standards apply to different syndicates. It's fair to say we're in that sort of top category of Lloyd's syndicates now. But I think the others in that top slice would also be very much lines to stand markets. You say pet hates. I mean, I'm actually a very happy, kind of positive person, but I do have some pet hates. One is signing down, where we've done all the bloody work and possibly written the wording, and others have just come along for the ride at the bottom of the slip. I've never accepted, going back to the 80s and 90s, why we should be treated the same as a follow market who doesn't bring anything to the party. And the other thing is where we see a major risk late in the process. And the target we've set ourselves is to be a top 3 market in everything we do. So I always say to the guys, we lead or co-lead over 90% of our business. We can't lead absolutely everything, but if we don't lead it, we should be seeing it second or third, right on the shoulder of the leader, a bit like kind of 10,000 meter runner. That's where we should be. And, I think Rich would agree. I'm a very positive person 99% of the time, but that happens sometimes, and I'm not happy when it happens.
I suppose things like consortia, your line's fixed within the consortium, so you don't get signed down. I mean, okay, the consortium could be signed down as a whole, and that's a problem for all of you. But so, yes, something like a consortia, it seemed like it sounded like a good solution.
Yeah, but also I think that's part of the incremental benefit of the consortia is building a critical mass of capacity, which gives you more influence within a placement. So I think that's another benefit of actually forming consortia, that certainly if people with smaller lines, they get treated the same as part of the consortia.
Obviously, Lloyd's a great place for innovation, or yes, I think coming back, and certainly now with so much focus. We've just had Rachel Turk on the programme actually, and we're going in detail into the innovation class and the transition class, and obviously now pushing to get out of the way for anyone who wants to innovate, really give permission for that to happen. Something innovative that we spoke about a couple of years ago that you were quite excited about was the intellectual property class. It probably hasn't worked out the way you wanted it to. Anything we can learn about that, or is it something not insurable, having dipped your toe into that water and maybe got nibbled by a few sharks? Or what's the experience of what you've learned from it?
I think we always pride ourselves on wanting to try and innovate and trying to address shortfalls of market capacity. And when you look at the amount of intangible assets that are in the world, and insurance's focus on serving the tangible asset world, there is certainly space for products there to try and address that gap. I think lessons learnt, insurance is all about alignment of interest and also about timing. And when we launched the product, it was at a time of very stressed credit conditions in the market. And the early adopters of the product and early clients in the product, unfortunately, fell victim to those conditions. So I think lessons learned, we'll always try and innovate, but we innovate with a lot of data and with best of intentions about getting the alignment right. And we can't get everything right. And I think we made a bold decision to address the issues that we were seeing very, very quickly and quicker than others operating in that space. And then we move on to looking at other products.
But there's not something inherently uninsurable about it. Do you think under different circumstances, different structures, different time, it could work?
I think under different structures, but I think at the moment there's a gap between what clients want and what structures will float versus what we would need for it to be insurable. So it's a question of if and when we can bridge that gap.
So you'd never say never. If ever things change, you can have another look at it. But presumably, I suppose the other fundamental things must be very difficult to value, and the value probably changes as well.
Yeah. Again, the part of the collateral that was exposed was the IP. And really, it's an experimental science around what those valuations are in a stressed fire sale scenario. So again, lessons learned around that as well.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of the opposite of demand surge, isn't it? When people know that you have to sell, being forced seller, then I suppose whatever that is. The whole point of innovating is it's actually really hard and you have to accept failure. And then the amount of times I've been to a conference where people say, we've got to accept failure, we've got to embrace this, we've got to fail fast and all this sort of techie sounding stuff. But actually the insurance industry is terrible at failing fast and just cracking on and saying, well, we learned something, but yeah, okay, we're not doing that next year, fine. That we should all probably, again, culturally and us as journalists, again, I'd say we've got to be part of moving on, which is why I want to have an open conversation about it and say, right, there's something to learn, there's plenty of new business. For example, I had Keita on the show, really interesting about carbon credits insurance. That sounds like it could be in your sort of sweet spot because it includes things like political risk and obviously climate change, of course, being something that you major on. Is that of interest to you? I mean, people have described that as the next cyber, perhaps.
I think, again, in terms of our approach to energy, underwriting, renewables, etc., I think we have had a reboot around our outlook on that. And I think we have to look at the whole supply chain of requirements of energy companies on their transition journeys. So you start off with putting some criteria that are nice and clear to get energy companies to engage in around what we really mean by ESG transition and what we're expecting to see them doing, which is effectively just having some tangible, measurable targets that are realistic and that they stick to. And we have a very open conversation about, are they sticking to them?
And that's not 2050, that's...
No, immediate.
What was in the business plan for this year?
Exactly. Yes. So that's been very well received. And again, I think there's a bit of a misconception that energy companies wouldn't want to engage on this stuff. I think we've been really pleasantly surprised. I mean, they face questions from their own investors around what their transition plans are, etc. So it's just an extension of that they would talk to their insurance providers in the same way. So we've been very pleasantly surprised about that. And then as part of that journey, you would insure their traditional assets, you would insure their construction projects that are edging towards transition, their renewables, their proper green business. And of course, we're talking to them about our whole range of other products. So as you say, political risk, there's decommissioning bonding, and carbon credits is something that we've been having lots of conversations around, and carbon storage products as well. So again, it's something that they need to engage with lots of data. We need to make these underwriting decisions in an informed way, but it's part of that overall transition piece and transition journey. It's certainly something that we are actively engaged in. So
we should be watching this space, and when we hear about someone doing something innovative, something to do with climate, we should probably think about Fidelis Partnership.
Absolutely.
Well, we're sitting here in Monte Carlo at the Rendezvous. It's just the beginning. What sort of tone discussions are you expecting to be having this year?
I think cat is obviously a dominant subject each year at the Rendezvous. There is, I think, less alignment this year between brokers and markets than last year. Don't forget, we're still in very recent muscle memory of a 5 to 6 year period of the cat market losing money hand over fist, in large part, in my view, because a lot of people are in complete denial about climate change. And I think I may have said this to you last year, Mark, but we brought in Jeff Masters, who's a sort of guru of US weather, who took a look at the vendor models which the industries use and threw his hands up in the air metaphorically and said, these are 20th century models for 21st century weather. And yes, the distribution of the losses in the last 18 months, we're not even halfway through wind season yet, and there's systems in the Atlantic right now. Let's be careful what we say now. But the recent distribution of losses has been towards certainly as far as North America is concerned, the admitted carriers who are getting killed by this frequency. And, they've got a real issue about how they deal with it. And the reinsurance market has escaped a lot of it. But I think the ultimate indication of where the future path of travel is that there's no new capital coming in. And we speak to bankers, lawyers, rating agencies all the time, and there are no new cat companies coming in. There's some froth in the news here at the moment, but whether that's going to turn into anything tangible is another matter. But that's the ultimate arbiter, and we have increased demand, and we have static, maybe retained earnings are contributing towards a modest increase in supply. But to us, the equation is broadly in equilibrium, and we don't expect pronounced movements either way for next year. Again, our position is a little bit different to a lot of people in the market in that we are price makers, we are thought leaders, we are go-to markets for people who need something a bit different, and we use that to get bespoke deals which are perhaps better than the market. But certainly for our book, I think I'm very happy with our cat book, and I think our partners at the IG are. We are fully embracing the cold reality of climate change and underwriting accordingly. We have cat bonds that kick in for really big losses, and we're largely not exposed to the sort of attrition that we're seeing at the moment with all these SCS losses. And we've missed a whole slew of losses this year because of our underwriting approach.
Your message is presumably we're not going to jump back down into that pit because it's not
absolutely
going
not.
away. This
Absolutely
frequency
not.
is still there.
Well, who was it saying the other day $150 billion of cat losses is a new norm?
That was for risk.
Yeah.
So yes, within my world, that's publicly available information. I'm sure Jeff Masters can say it's worse than that. So that gives us a rough idea.
I think Jeff would be happy with $150 billion, but let's not forget, we still have people, and it does go to some of these ill-starred attempted capital raises. We hear anecdotes about people trying to raise money based on unadjusted RMS and AIR with just nothing to say about what's happening to our climate. And no wonder the investment community are sitting on their hands, because this stuff is literally incredible to them. They're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And I think that explains, and we're very close to the bankers and the investment community, that explains why people are not writing checks.
Yeah.
It's just not plausible.
That various number is up 15%.
Well, there's still a mentality, and I talk about it all the time, particularly when you get to this time of the year. It's a sort of Monte Carlo thing. When people start talking about a clean year, I mean, we've already had over 100 billion already. There's still that old school attitude that we're going to have a quote unquote clean year. There are no clean years. It doesn't happen with climate change anymore. We used to have them. I remember we started Lancashire in 2006. There were no cat losses, I think 0. And we made an extraordinary return. But those days are long gone, and you have to underwrite accordingly.
Sometimes after a couple of clean years, reinsurers often talk about relevance and wanting to stay relevant. And people don't seem to want to pay what it's actually going to cost to insure and reinsure these losses that are getting worse year on year. How do you stay relevant at the same time as knowing that you have to charge a certain price and knowing that a lot of people still haven't worked out that this is the new price, or they don't necessarily agree with you? Or they've got a muscle memory of getting things cheaper after a couple of clean years or a couple of very profitable years.
Well, yeah, I would politely reject the premise of a clean year. They don't exist. The relevance point, I think, is very fair. And I think there's a lot of people...
we're still relevant because it's still here for the massive ones that are going to happen.
I think there's a lot of people jostling to provide the same old product and not offering anything different. I think service is key. As I said, we've just literally had some clients in Canada, needing urgent backup protection. I'm very critical of our market, where particularly at times of year coinciding with school holidays, that people can't even get hold of markets. I think I've said in other interviews recently, one thing you can say about me, one thing you can say about us is we've always got a price. You may not always like it, but we've got a price and we've got meaningful capacity and we're in the office. And I mean physically in the office, by the way. So I think that's a large part of the answer to your question, Mark, is you've got to provide the service. Do clients always like our price on our product? No, they don't. But people need contract certainty and they need balance sheet protection. Now, we are open to other products, for example, structured products, which I think are of increased relevance now. And that's something that, we are discussing with a lot of clients here this week. We would even look at certain aggregate products if they attached at the right point. I think the problem is we've all seen some publicity around Allstate recently and the ag product there, and we weren't closely involved in those discussions. There is probably an ag product we could craft at a level, not at the level they were seeking to buy. But again, we're open to different things. We're not just saying we will only sell a 1 in 100 occurrence product at the 1 in 10 or the 1 in 20, even if those metrics are credible.
But you want a proper buffer.
Yeah.
You don't want to just be kicking in just because it's a reasonably bad year.
No, I mean, to your earlier point, we absolutely will never drop back into the maelstrom of attrition. We're not doing that.
You mentioned about that fundraising environment. It's just not happening as far as you're concerned.
No, absolutely not.
I'm always looking for sort of leading indicators of a change in the market. We've had this discussion a couple of times. I think you first said that this market was shut a couple of years ago. This is the more collateralized ILS retro market. Is it still shut?
I think, dare I say, I have been proved right versus what I said to you 2 years ago. I think the conventional wisdom would have been that if there were a couple of years where losses fell largely on admitted markets rather than reinsurers, that memories would prove short and that capital would come back flooding in. That was the consensus 2 years ago. I stood against that consensus, and I made the point to you I've just made about the disconnect between what people seeking to raise capital are basing their capital raises on and the common sense approach of the investment community, and nothing's changed. And I think people would have been surprised 2 years ago, but I have been proved right. Despite relatively light losses to the reinsurance market, there's no new money. So I think I got that one right.
I suppose, and I can see your numbers once a quarter. You've been proved right that you can sell your product at these prices because there's clearly demand. they would rather not pay those prices if they could get it cheaper somewhere else. But people value your capacity and they need your capacity.
They do. And, again, it goes back to the service point, the relevance point, the size point. If you're offering a $25 million line and you're doing something a bit different, you're probably not very relevant. But if you're offering a $150 million line and your service is best in breed. And another thing, Mark, that's more to the human side of things, which has changed since COVID, is people don't travel anymore. At any one time, we have 10, 12, 15 underwriters in various parts of the world. We do go and see our clients all the time, and that makes a difference. And we have looked at the world, and we have looked at the changing nature of the global economy, at the increasingly multipolar nature of the global economy, at the growth of the BRICS group. So with the recent 5 or 6 admissions, and then Nigeria and Indonesia slated for admission next year, the BRICS will comprise 42% of global GDP by this time next year. Now, we as an industry do a terrible job of trading outside of North America, Western Europe, Japan, and Australasia. Absolutely awful. We should collectively hang our heads in shame, and we are committed to doing better. And Charlie Mathias, he's my deputy chairman, he's incredibly experienced and a global guy, has lived all over the world, is pioneering what we're calling our BRICS Plus approach, where we are working with our partners around the world, trying to identify centers of strong economic growth where our market has traditionally performed very poorly, and to do better.
Would you end up having offices in those places?
I don't think so. I've never been that kind of let's go and plant lots of flags type of guy. I think in some areas we've opened up in Abu Dhabi since we last spoke, and that's been very successful. The growth in the GCC region is obviously exponential. That's a good place for us to look at growth throughout the GCC region. Obviously, we all know about NEOM. We are partners with NEOM. We are partners with Marsh. We are partners with Saudi Re on the NEOM project. We're already co-leading off various elements of their coverage, and that's super exciting. I don't know how close you are to it. It's quite extraordinary what's going on there. United Arab Emirates are an increasingly muscular player. And
it's not just GCC, isn't it? There's being written out as if you can getting Indian business, North African business.
Absolutely. The UAE are crafting what they're calling CEPAs, comprehensive economic partnership agreements, with all sorts of companies. I think, and I may get this wrong, but I think they've just done one with India and Indonesia, so big economies. Kenya, I think, as well. So that's a great sort of springboard for us, and we're working closely with our partners in Abu Dhabi to provide underwriting expertise.
And does that dovetail in with the Lloyd's licensing as well?
Yes, it does. Yeah, absolutely. But also there's other important areas of economic activity. We've recently been in Brazil. We have a strategy for the whole of Latin America. India is a massive market, still very much a broker market. We know people like Dastas and Bodas in Mumbai. These are fantastic people, and they have huge reach in that enormous economy. Singapore is increasingly a base for Chinese entrepreneurs who perhaps have a double base, if you like, in mainland China and in Singapore. And we have underwriters there on a regular basis. We're not particularly keen on just opening endless offices, Mark. It's very expensive, and the danger is that then those local offices get sucked into writing local business at pretty poor terms. Again, everything, as you know, goes through our twice daily underwriting call, and we will never delegate underwriting authority to regional hubs around the world. We just prefer to go there a lot and to have the language capability whenever possible. So, I've got quite a few languages. We've got Portuguese speakers, we've got Spanish speakers, French speakers, Arabic speakers. So we are very global, and we do not do the old-fashioned London market thing of just turning up in a 3-piece suit and speaking English to everybody. We're much more global than that, and it's really paying dividends. And we're very excited about it. I have to say, you asked about what had changed since last year. That's possibly the biggest change, is us really embracing the multipolar world and global growth.
That's really interesting because, yes, the hundreds of conversations I have with people saying, yes, we're still only interested in the English-speaking peoples plus Japan and a bit of this, which is, yes, in this century, it doesn't seem to make a huge amount of business sense. Anyway, so you're out in the world, sniffing around. Yes, perhaps right, giving you the canine association that we always have with you, Richard. So talking about positive things, when you're sniffing around, what are the things that smell good? Where are the best opportunities at the moment?
I think it's not straying off into unfamiliar territory in terms of product lines. It's basically the same products, but just with geographical diversification. Obviously, we have to adapt our underwriting approach to be territory specific, and certainly in terms of the bespoke lines, we absolutely enforce with our underwriters that the underwriting approach is culturally and geopolitically appropriate as well. So, for instance, with our political risk lines, we do not accept the London market-centric view that you would assess a risk in the Middle East, for instance, and just be reading the control risks, or someone who's a very Western-centric view of whatever the geopolitical situation is around a given transaction. We insist our underwriters will read all of the relevant data sources and consult those before coming up with an underwriting recommendation. And that's something we're really proud of. The world is increasingly geopolitically complex and multipolar, to Richard's point. So I think that's something that we pride ourselves on, that when we go into different territories, we do have that triangulation of local positions from every side of the house in around a given transaction.
So political risk, definitely something that you say lots of opportunity for interesting growth.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, and all over the world.
Yeah.
Any other classes, any more geographies?
Yeah, and just to build on the pole risk point that Rich makes, if you look at a complex situation in, let's say, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, anyway, really, if you look at that situation just through the sort of Anglosphere lens, you're going to have a pretty unbalanced view of what's going on. In the Middle East, if you consult Al Jazeera, if you consult Le Monde, if you consult Chinese media, Israeli media, Russian media, you're going to get a much better balanced view of what's going on and make better underwriting decisions. I remember sort of a couple of risks that stand out in the memory, where one risk, which we currently underwrite, a risk in Iraqi Kurdistan, where the broker came to the market. It's actually an Emirati assured who we cover. And the broker's slip said for situation Iraq. And this was when Iraq was very chaotic. I'm pleased to say things are much less chaotic now. And people have shied away from the risk, saying, we can't possibly do that.
But they hadn't looked to see where
it was Kurdistan, which particularly at that time, it's changed a bit now, was very, very autonomous. And it was a very different risk profile from something in Baghdad or Basra. But again, just poor knowledge, poor context around the risk, poorly broked as well, I have to say. And then I remember also a motorway in Cuba being brought in, and people think, oh my God, the American sanctions, whatever. The contractor was Odebrecht, which has since had a few issues, but it was a big Brazilian contractor. Brazilian-Cuban relations have always been excellent. Not so much under Bolsonaro, but mainly have been excellent. So again, it's that multipolar approach to pole risk, and I think we do it better than others because we have that approach. It applies to plenty of other lines as well, right?
Yes. Where else is interesting?
So again, the misconceptions around the volume of marine business that's transacted purely in London. I think you're right to say the UAE in particular has become a hub for capturing business. It just does not make its way to London. And getting out, seeing clients, and basically being able to capture that at source and the local orders. If stuff does come to London, there's always a local order as well. That's something we challenge our underwriters to do. And the fact that the majority of marine business, much as it's a huge part of the London book, is actually transacted outside of London, and Middle East in particular, it's one of the biggest areas. That's something that's really exciting for us.
Obviously, and you're already one of the biggest marine insurers in the world when you tot up with Navium. I was going to ask you about that. Obviously, we've had this Baltimore Bridge strike loss, but it hasn't really even started. It's going to be a long loss adjusting process and a recovery process. Is it affecting the market in any way at the moment?
Not as far as we can see. So
is that frustrating, or what do you feel about it? Or is it something you just have to wait?
I think with Ever, it's a highly complex claim, and it will take a very, very long time to work through the system. And I think we often see major events and assume there's going to be an immediate reaction. And I think that does frustrate us, because sometimes we, with our underwriting call and the structure, we're very joined up between the insurance and the reinsurance sides of the house and understand the true cost of doing business and the combined ratios.
I suppose I should examine, was it already in the playbook? We know that ships can strike bridges. In fact, they do. If it was only in the press afterwards, I realised that it happens more regularly than you would have assumed. And obviously it doesn't end up shutting the bridge or breaking the bridge that often or closing the port that often. But in terms of that, was it something that was in the playbook? This is a business as usual style loss. Obviously you don't want it to happen, but it happens. And as marine underwriters, you expect this kind of thing to happen. Sometimes when something happens that we don't expect to happen, like we had with COVID, we didn't expect the BI to happen in that way. We were expecting to have excess mortality and other things. We thought about pandemics, we haven't thought about them in a non-marine way. And obviously that becomes a shock because it's a surprise to an underwriter if something you hadn't necessarily priced for. Again, with this, was it something you had priced for? Is there an element of shock to it?
I think it's a BAU loss.
So it is. It is. It's just maybe severity is a bit of a shock or whatever. Well, we don't know severity yet because it just takes, how long does it take to fix a bridge?
Exactly.
I think it's firmly in the category of shit happens.
Okay, another shit happens loss is an unexpected cyber loss. So you're not the world's biggest cyber reinsurance market, but obviously this is, again, in a market with a huge amount of opportunity. We know demand's going to keep going, and we know that there will be opportunities to deploy capacity in that market. And we've had this CrowdStrike loss. Again, it was one that may not have been in everyone's playbook, particularly some of the newer people coming in higher up. They might have thought, oh, I assume this was a malicious sort of class where somebody, with a hoodie on does something nasty. Whereas this is just some accidental update went wrong and it turned out to be far more severe and far more sort of widespread. Do you think psychologically that bit of a shock type loss?
I think a very similar way we reflect on it, and we, as you know, we have been consciously underweight in cyber market, really with the rationale being, do people really understand aggregation? What does the systemic event really look like? What is the 9/11 for the cyber market? And so we're watching that event from the outside really with great interest. And we related a little bit to the surprise of the PV market to Russia, Ukraine and the Ukraine losses in particular, because a huge proportion of that market is facilitized. There has been a gold rush in that market. And I think underwriting standards have been, in terms of understanding aggregation, the terms and conditions that are in policies, etc. As soon as it's happened, I think there were some very difficult conversations with underwriters being asked, what's our number? How bad is this? And it was all happened at the weekend, and a lot of scrambling around, a lot of pens down, which I think really showed, I guess, the immaturity of the market and the need for real leadership in that market. So I think it turned out to be, again, another BAU type event. I think the losses are coming through in terms of what the quantum is, but it's not a game changer. But it was a real shock, I think, in terms of underwriting standards as to what the market have been doing and how many people really do know what they're doing in that space. So I think we've learned a lot from that.
So political risk, political violence, yes. But what about cyber in terms of this question of the CrowdStrike? Do you think it's something that's a bit of a shock? Do you think there will be underwriters who are surprised that they weren't expecting this, particularly if they were quite high up?
I would say that the shock factor was the same as the political risk and that side of things, because it was a surprise that this might have been covered. So it shows people do not know what they're writing.
The shock for me is that anyone could be shocked that Russia could invade Ukraine when they'd already invaded Crimea 10 years before. It was just a very, very surprising. In fact, I remember having a discreet conversation with someone who was running an MGA and moved into political risk and political violence about 8 or 9 years ago, and very conscientious, very, very good MGA. Said, well, I've built in all the aggregation things. I've got everything, I've got all the tech, I've got everything ready, because I was expecting all my paper providers to want to know all this stuff and to have all this at their fingertips. So I've built it. And I've spent a lot of money building that because I thought that's the absolute minimum thing I should be doing. So you should be able to pinpoint your aggregations anywhere, anytime. But no one asked me for it. But it was the shock that he'd spent a lot of money building something very sophisticated that no one had actually asked for. What about AI? Mr. Brindle, you're probably not the most techie person. I'm just taking a wild guess.
Monstrously on for.
I know, but you like having technologists around and you like having them close to the underwriters. When people explain to you what it can do, to get excited? How far do you think you can go?
I'll let Rich do this, the second part of this answer. What I would say about the type of business that we do is we saw in lockdown how inefficient it is not trading this business in person. We do, particularly in our bespoke book, but also in our specialty book, pretty complicated transactions. And if you try reducing a submission by a broker on a complex political or economic bespoke risk to some sort of electronic submission, it's almost impossible at the moment. Never say never. We found that we were getting emails from brokers which were basically very long essays, and we were then responding with equally long essays, asking all our questions, and it was extraordinarily inefficient. Whereas now we are very much an in-person market. We, as you know, have obviously our offices in Bishopsgate, but we also have our trading forum in Lime Street, and we tend to trade those sort of deals face-to-face. We're not on the personalised business mark. I think personalised has to be digitised. Of course it does. Of course it does. And large parts of that industry are still very, very analogue. But the stuff that we do, Rich, you take over, but certainly for now, there's no sign that we could transact it in any other way than the way that we currently do. Of course, our technology, perhaps you could talk about a bit more, is industry leading, and we take it very, very seriously. But in terms of the front end, the underwriting, I don't think it's ready yet.
So there won't be a sort of Brindle bot taking the underwriting calls.
Brindle bot, that makes the mind boggle.
No, I think we're in the non-commoditized space. It's the pond in which we fish in, especially by its nature, requires input. But I think that's where, when we talk about tech and investment in tech, it's about that input, using big data in a really smart, innovative way to make the best underwriting decisions. And whether it's geo-tracking of ships and linking that to breach zones on marine war accounts or aviation, knowing exactly where aircraft are at a given time in terms of managing aggregations, in terms of a man-made or natural cat event, that sort of thing is where there is real value for the industry in using tech.
But also, sorry to interrupt, Rich, I would say also, again, there's no substitute for hard work, Mark, to be best in breed underwriters. And the reason I say that is there have been particular scenarios in the aviation world in the last couple of years, apart from Russia, Ukraine, Sudan, sadly, is one example that springs to mind. Also the Prigozhin march on Moscow, where this stuff erupted at the weekend. And you can talk about AI all you like. The reality is we were the only people who responded at the weekend. So you can have the most wonderful technology, but if the people aren't actually making it work, then it's kind of irrelevant. So the fact that we were in the office at the weekend, responding, talking to our clients, we've, for example, recently developed an incredibly close partnership with Middle Eastern Airlines, which is the Lebanese national carrier. That's all based on the people. So I do think we have to be a bit careful with this, because at the end of the day, it's about relationships, and we work very, very hard on those, and we work bloody hard too. And that's the best way to be market leading.
What about getting that AI to do lots of hard work for you?
That's exactly what Rich just said. So in terms of our ability, which I think is unparalleled in the market, to know exactly where all our aircraft and our ships are at any one moment, obviously gives us a massive advantage in a scenario like I've just described.
And also in terms of ingesting huge amounts of data and looking for patterns and looking for things that a human, an experienced human, said, look for these red flags in these inspection reports. I won't read all 142 of them over the weekend. But that kind of thing. So is that sort of to try and improve the skill, again, to ingest as much data as you can and have almost of this indefatigable assistant? Is that the way you'd look at it?
Yeah, very fair.
Yeah.
What you'd say, great, I can get this thing, once I've trended up and it doesn't make mistakes, or makes very few mistakes, it can now proffer something up to me and say, I've read all these reports. Have you seen location number 72, which you probably wouldn't have been on top of your list, has got something a bit nasty?
For example, Mark, with the recent, obviously the situation between Israel and Hezbollah is very concerning. And when there have been flare-ups, we've had real-time information about exactly which aircraft are at Beirut International and Ben Gurion. I don't think anybody else has that.
No.
So that, to your point, is your indefatigable friend to help you make better underwriting decisions and provide a better service to your clients.
Anything else we should be discussing that we haven't? We've had a good chat.
No, I think that covers it.
That's it, yeah.
Yep.
No, you're both looking very happy. So I just wish you a very good rendezvous and another good year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this program. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience because you know you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry. The Voice of Insurance podcast is produced in association with Advantage Go, enabling enterprise-scale underwriting through a single pane of glass. Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.